Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with Kelly McCormick about the problem of blame and her reasons for thinking that we shouldn't eliminate it from our lives.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Kelly McCormick, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Texas Christian University. Kelly works on several issues in moral psychology and the free will debate, and she's published papers on many of the topics that we've discussed on this podcast, even including a time travel version of a Frankfurt case, which I'm a very big fan of. She is the author of a book called The Problem of Blame, Making Sense of Moral Anger, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2022. And we've asked her to join us today to talk about the project of that book. So welcome to the show, Kelly. Could you start by telling us and our audience a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on issues related to free will?
Yeah, so thank you so much for inviting me. I was very excited to get to join this awesome project. I've been long-time listener, first-time guest.
Nice. I love it.
But so how did I get interested in free will? So my interest in free will started back in grad school. So I went to Syracuse, and there wasn't really a free will person there. But what happened was I took a seminar on free will with Mark Heller, who had dabbled a little bit in his earlier career, and he was interested in robot cats and how the term free will refers. So it was a side interest of his. And so I took that seminar early on, and I just loved it. So we did a lot of the classics. We read Bin and Wagon's book. And then one of the things we did for the last chunk of the semester was Paraboom's book, Living Without Free Will. And so it was still pretty new at the time, which makes me feel very old. But so it was kind of this fresh new idea, and everyone was excited about really laying out the arguments for hard incompatibilism. And when I read that, I just thought it was one of those kind of brilliant books where you take this impossible dialectic and make it somehow seem super clear. And then also managed to say something really new and novel and interesting about it. So that book for me and that experience was kind of this is what I want to do someday when I get a little bit smarter. is something like that. And so I was really hooked on free will, and I was especially interested in skeptical views of free will when I kind of got started. But then something always kind of bugged me about skepticism at the same time, and it was this kind of nagging feeling that there was so much focus on the potential harms to wrongdoers, but almost no mention of the harms to victims. And I just found this super puzzling. And so while I really was persuaded by the skeptical arguments, it struck me as a kind of serious problem that I couldn't quite put my finger on, that something was being sort of left out of these skeptical views. And so I think that worry kind of subconsciously started to push me back towards success theories of free will. And I was like, no, I want to make sense of how we can have it, but it's so hard. These skeptical concerns are really serious. So, what do I do? And then just kind of at the right time, I stumbled upon Manuel Vargas's revisionism. So it was at the time he was working on Building Better Beings, which is a fantastic book. And he had a couple papers out, and I luckily stumbled upon them and was like, oh, this is kind of what I want to do, is take all these methodological skeptical concerns seriously, but still try to find a way to argue that we can still be free and responsible. And so I was hooked on revisionism, and I decided maybe I want to write a dissertation on this stuff. But again, I didn't have a lot of free will people at Syracuse. I was lucky enough that Dirk was close. I was able to audit a free will seminar at Cornell. And so that was great. So I was like, maybe I can actually do this. I've got one person who will read this thing. but then, so then I got into revisionism. And so I wrote this paper, and there really wasn't anyone in my department or around that knew enough about it to really like give me good feedback. So I took a chance and I just emailed Manuel and was like, hey, of course you're not going to answer this email, but if a miracle happens and like you have time to read this, that would be awesome. And lo and behold, he's like one of the nicest philosophers on the planet and just so generous with his time. And so I got a response.
Yeah. Awesome.
And he gave me these really detailed comments, and it really helped make the paper better. That was my first publication in Journal of Ethics and Social Philosophy. It's anchoring a revisionist account of moral responsibility. And from there, he was like, hey, send me your stuff as you're working on it. Stay in touch. Let me know if I can help. And that was just like a huge game changer for me in terms of the sorts of projects I was interested in and ended up working on in the dissertation and since then. So that's just like a nice story about graduate school not being horrible all the time. There are a lot of really nice folks out there. So for grad students listening, like send the email. The worst thing that's going to happen is you won't get a response, but you might get a really great response, and then it turns out well. So don't be afraid to do that. But yeah, that's how I got interested in free will and how it kind of like took hold. And then I spent a couple years thinking most closely about revisionism, and then I kind of started to transition into work on blame because of questions about basic desert that I found kind of at the heart of the disagreement between revisionists and skeptics like Paraboom. And so I wanted to think more carefully about that. And then that just landed me more firmly in the land of blame and figuring out how that was deserved. So that's how I got here, I guess.
Cool.
Yeah, very cool.
That's great.
Well, in your book, The Problem of Blame, you start by noting that blame is puzzling. It's a puzzling phenomenon, something that we value and that we also may wish to be rid of. Could you describe why it seems like we both want and don't want blame in our lives?
Yeah, so the problem as I see it is just one of those philosophical problems that seems to be hanging out somewhere in the foundation of a philosophical debate. It's usually causing trouble, and no one's really kind of dug it out and examined it closely all on its own. So I'm a glutton for punishment, and I like thinking about stuff like that. And so the way I see the problem is basically that there's this tension between the good stuff that blame does for us. So it feels like this really essential way of calling out injustice and holding one another accountable. And it also seems really important to like defending victims of wrongdoing in some way. But then on the other hand, it's got all this nastiness. So anger, harm, sometimes even violence that's associated with it. And so it's one of those features of life that I think has this kind of, you can't live with it, can't live without it sort of flavor. And so given the popularity of skeptical views about free will in the last like decade or two, and by extension, responsibility and blame, I really wanted to look more carefully into this question of whether or not we can ever provide a normatively adequate account of the worst kind of blame. So the angry, visceral kind. Can we defend that kind of blame and argue that that's permissible? And so I call that variety of blame reactive blame. And what I try to do in the first half of the book is just really meticulously try to make a case for thinking that if we can argue reactive, angry blame is both valuable and deserved in the basic sense, I don't see any room for skeptics to like continue to push back that it's not permissible. So I draw this analogy with the problem of punishment and try to show that the same kind of desiderata that function there also function when it comes to the problem of blame, and then kind of go from there and try to make the case for being able to meet those two desiderata.
That makes sense. You take your central philosophical opponents to be blame curmudgeons. That's your expression. Those who are skeptical of the permissibility of blame, or who argue that blame should be eliminated from our lives. Could you say a bit more about these blame curmudgeons and some of the reasons that they hold their position?
Yeah, for sure. So one thing is I can't take total credit for the phrase. It was actually Christopher Franklin that came up
Oh
with it,
yeah.
as far as I know. So he's got a really great chapter in the volume by Neil Tognazzini and Justin Coates, where he argues for the value account of blame. And that's how he frames his sort of skeptical interlocutors, as these blame
Gotcha.
curmudgeons.
He's
And I
probably
just
borrowing
love.
that. He's probably borrowing that term from John Fisher too, because Fisher uses it to talk about immortality curmudgeons like Bernard Williams.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah. Uh-huh.
I thought there was like another thread somewhere that
Yeah.
he was pulling on. So thank you. That solves the mystery for it. That it was John Fisher that started introducing it
Yeah.
to this debate.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I can't take credit for it, but I thought it was just kind of a perfect way of describing the narrow subset of views that I'm interested in. So those are going to be the folks so the kind of paradigmatic examples I have in mind here are like Bruce Waller, Dirk Paraboom, and Greg Caruso. So these are the folks who are not just skeptical about free will, but they also have some sort of like explicit prescriptive component of their views. So some kind of prescriptive eliminativism. So we should be concerned about the existence of free will, responsibility, and blame. And in light of that concern, we should actually do something. Namely, we should try to get rid of blame and any of the sort of attendant attitudes and practices that depend on this idea that it's deserved in the basic sense. So that's the kind of target that I have in mind. I will say, if Greg is listening, I know he hates the phrase. Well, I don't know if hates is quite right, but he finds it a little bit unfair. And so I'm sorry, Greg, but I do think it's a really helpful term. And one thing I will say about the blame curmudgeons phrase is that I do think it could be a little bit misleading because the term curmudgeon has this kind of negative connotation. They're these like crotchety guys running around saying no more free will. But I think actually what these folks have in common is that they're all really nice people. And so there's this kind of strange tension where what I think motivates the folks I'm calling curmudgeons the most is that they're really worried about harming people undeservedly. So they have this really like valuable, noble, motivating concern, which is we shouldn't hurt people who don't deserve it. And if blame is never deserved and it's this angry kind of punitive thing, then by ascribing to free will and correspondingly reactive blame, what we're doing is like harming people all over the place when they don't deserve it, and we shouldn't do that. So that I think is the motivating concern for these folks. And so while I like the phrase blame curmudgeons, it might be like just a little bit unfair in that respect. So I just wanted to kind of flag that. These are good folks who are the curmudgeons. They have noble concerns.
Yeah. Well, you argue that meeting the challenge of the blame curmudgeons requires getting clear on the notion of blame at issue. So could you say a bit about how you're thinking of the blame that gives rise to the problem and that blame curmudgeons are curmudgeons about?
I think that when we explicitly restrict our focus to reactive blame, that invites us to think more carefully about the role that the negative reactive attitudes play for this kind of angry, harmful stuff that we're worried about. And so there's this long history in the literature of sort of dismissing this kind of blame because it's not descriptively accurate. And that's because when it comes to the actual psychological phenomenon of blame, there seems to be just loads of examples of instances of genuine blame without the experience of any of the varieties of moral anger. And so I think this is representative of a mistake that a lot of folks make in terms of how they think about reactive blame. basically they're assuming some kind of reactive essentialism, and they're thinking about the experience of the negative reactive attitudes as this necessary condition for every genuine instance of reactive blame. And so at the start of the book, I take some time teasing out how to make sense of other more plausible ways of thinking about the nature of the central role of the negative reactive attitudes and what that plays for blame. So what I have in mind here and what I talk about in the book is that as an alternative to reactive essentialism, which I don't think anyone really actually endorses, maybe Susan Wolf, the alternatives that are more plausible are going to be something like functional reactivity or canonical reactivity. So the way Angela Smith and maybe even Chris Franklin talk about the role of the negative reactive attitudes and anger as part of the function of blame, or like a necessary feature of meeting the aims of blame, is what I would call functional reactivity. And that's a better way of thinking about what we're talking about when we talk about reactive blame, the angry kind of blame. Mm-hmm. Anger doesn't have to always be there, but it does have to be part of the story we tell about how to meet the aims or the function of blame. And then the other alternative that I think is really plausible is one that, so it's this story about canonical reactivity. So the idea is that the central role that the reactive attitudes play for blame is not this essential one. It doesn't have to always be present, but it is necessary to understand the kind of thing that we're talking about. So think about the analogy of a heart. Part of what we point to figure out the kind of things hearts are is that they play this role in a circulatory system and they pump blood. Mm-hmm. But if a heart stops beating, if someone's having a heart attack, we wouldn't say that they no longer have a heart. Mm-hmm. It's a defective heart. And I think that's another way to think about the role of the reactive attitudes when it comes to angry or reactive blame. It doesn't have to be this like essential feature that's present all the time, but it might be an essential feature of distinguishing the kind of thing we're talking about from other kinds of things. So that's part of the picture. And then when it comes to the nature of reactive blame, I'm also interested in figuring out whether we ought to take a wide or a narrow construal of which attitudes count as the relative reactive attitudes. Mm-hmm. And so the reason for that is that that's going to give us a clearer picture of what kind of propositional content these attitudes share in service of settling on an account of the right kind of reasons to blame, which I'm ultimately going to be interested in. I don't want to get too far into the weeds here, but I spend a lot of time in chapter 3 of the book talking about this. And what I settle on is a narrow construal of the negative reactive attitudes. So primarily concerning just the varieties of moral anger, resentment, indignation, and guilt. And I think these are precisely the kinds of harmful attitudes that blame curmudgeons are worried about in the first place. And the narrow construal is going to be the best way to, as folks like R.J. Wallace have said, thread this kind of needle that arises in thinking about an account of the negative reactive attitudes that's both psychologically realistic and allows these attitudes to kind of hang together as a class. Mm-hmm. So a big part of the project in the book is figuring out like what reactive blame is in the first place. What is the kind of blame that everyone's worried about? Yeah. And what role do these angry reactive attitudes play in it? And we don't want to say they're essential. That's not descriptively plausible, but they do play this really central role. How do we make sense of it? And then which ones really count to the problem of blame itself? And I think it's the varieties of moral anger. And then I also take a little bit of time defending cognitivism about reactive blame. And I think that's like, there's this underlying assumption amongst folks discussing reactive blame that some kind of cognitivism is true, but no one really argues for it. And it's controversial in other discussions of the emotions. And so recently, David Shoemaker has kind of pushed back against that assumption and tried to argue for a non-cognitivist account of certain kinds of blame. And so I kind of take his arguments as a target. Sorry, David. And try to argue that they actually give us more reason to be cognitivists. So I kind of want to shut the door on creeping worries about cognitivism, because we really do need it to make sense of the kind of account of basic dessert that I want to give, which is the fittingness account.
Right.
Yeah.
That's helpful. Well, you just mentioned basic dessert. I was going to ask about that in the next question. So one aspect of the blame at issue in this debate is that, it's basically deserved. Could you describe this notion of basic dessert as you understand it in terms of fittingness, and then maybe contrast it with non-basic notions of dessert?
Yeah, sure. So Michael McKenna has a really great phrase to describe the role that basic dessert plays in discussions of free will and blame. He calls it the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
Everyone knows it's there, but no one wants to talk about it.
Yeah.
And so one of the big projects that I wanted to tackle in the book was trying to give more of a shape to the elephant, as I say. Even if we can't get a really clear picture, I want a clearer picture, so that we can at least figure out when skeptics and success theorists are talking about the same thing or talking past each other. So a lot of the arguments for skepticism, I think, take this uncontroversial assumption that our blaming practices presuppose agents deserve praise and blame in the basic sense. And then they go on to argue that they can't deserve blame in this sense. And so we ought to give up the blaming practices that depend on them, or at least radically revise the way, or radically revise or excise the elements that do depend on basic dessert. So that's kind of the basic skeptical position. So in the book, I point out that this assumption about the importance of basic dessert is usually taken to be this kind of bedrock point of agreement among skeptics and non-skeptics alike, or at least it should be, to avoid kind of talking past each other. But again, there's very little discussion about what the heck this thing actually is. So what we can say about what basic dessert is not, is that it's not a kind of dessert grounded in any sort of consequentialist, contractualist, or forward-looking considerations. That's not the kind of thing we're talking about when we talk about basic dessert. But then when we try to figure out what it is, we kind of run into a wall a little bit. So as I mentioned a minute ago, I think that if we restrict our focus to reactive blame, the kind of angry blame that skeptics and curmudgeons are worried about, that can be really helpful to getting a clearer picture of basic dessert. So I'm going to call this account the fittingness account, and it's based on the way we already think about other affective attitudes. So we often make sense of whether or not other emotionally charged attitudes are appropriate in terms of whether or not they're fitting. And whether or not they're fitting depends on the kinds of reasons that they're based on. So the classic example that folks often cite is the one involving admiration and the evil demon. So this is from Derms and Jacobson. So if we imagine a world where an evil demon with no admirable qualities nonetheless commands us to admire him, or else some horrible punishment is going to befall us, this seems like a clear example where our admiration would be defective in some way. It's not fitting. And it's not fitting because it's based on the wrong kind of reasons. So the kind of reason for adopting this affective attitude in the evil demon case is what Pamela Hieronymi calls content-related reasons, and then Derek Parfit talks about these a lot too. He calls them state-given reasons. And at best, these kinds of reasons for getting yourself to have a certain attitude, at best they can justify our admiration of the demon, but there's still a sense in which there's a sense in which we wouldn't fault you for getting yourself to admire him, but there's still a sense in which it's not appropriate.
Right.
And so what you need in order for your admiration to be fitting is a different kind of reason, an object-focused reason. So one that tracks genuinely admirable properties possessed by the demon. So this is the story we get over in the analysis of other affective attitudes and the accounts of their fittingness. And so I think we should say the same thing about blame and basic desert. So one way of thinking about what's going on with your admiration in the evil demon case is that the demon doesn't deserve your admiration.
Mm-hmm.
So likewise, when the negative reactive attitudes that are central to reactive blame aren't fitting, when they're grounded in the wrong kind of reasons, I think they're not deserved in the basic sense. And so what basic desert of blame would amount to is something similar to what the fittingness of other affective attitudes amounts to. An agent deserves blame in the basic sense in virtue of some kind of desert base, where the relevant desert base has to be the right kind of reason or some kind of object focused reason to blame. So that kind of gives us the structure of the elephant, I guess, I'm trying to sketch. But in a lot of ways, that's the easy part. It's just kind of drawing an analogy to these other affective attitudes and what renders them fitting. The hard part is figuring out what the heck the right kinds of reasons to reactively blame actually are. And also doing so in a way that doesn't turn out to be viciously circular, because that's like a common objection to fittingness analyses of value in other areas. And so the account that I end up with is what I call RKR in the book. So my account of the right kind of reasons to blame and what would render reactive blame fitting or deserved in the basic sense is just this specific kind of object-focused reason, namely that the target of blame has actually violated what I call a non-extraneous expectation. So a non-extraneous expectation is going to be one that is in some sense constitutive of your interpersonal relationship with the target of blame. So I'm borrowing from like some Scanlonian stuff here in talk of constitutive expectations. And that, I think, is the kind of violation that gives us an object-focused reason to blame. So we decide whether someone is deserving of blame in the basic sense, just insofar as they actually did violate an expectation in this sort of way that's constitutive of their relationship. So it's like a really minimal idea that grounds basic desert of blame. There's like no mention of control or reasons responsiveness or anything like that.
Right.
And then I'm gonna use that. I use that view to kind of then build up an account of why this kind of blame is valuable. And also why I think it can be deserved. So if that's what basic desert means, do we ever actually deserve blame in the basic sense? And I'm going to argue yes, in part because it is this really like deflationary picture of what that object focused reason is. I think it's a lot easier than people assume. So some folks are going to see that as like a big problem with the view, like, too deflationary, too easy. But I think it's a merit of the view, and it's also kind of modular in a lot of ways. So if you want to like build in, or you think we should build in stronger control conditions for basic desert of blame, you can absolutely make a case for that. I'm just trying to give like the most basic version that I can figure out.
Yeah.
Nice.
Okay, so you mentioned a little bit just now about the value of blame. So why do you think that blame in the sense that you've been talking about is uniquely or plays this uniquely valuable role in our moral lives?
Yeah, I don't have a ton of new things to say about this. I think there's kind of a smorgasbord of views you can kind of pick from that give us these accounts of what's good about blame, even the reactive, angry kind. But the three accounts that I think are the most powerful, and that I point to in the book, Chris Franklin's value account of blame, I think is one of the big ones. And then also what Victoria McGeer says about blame as a costly attention-grabbing signal. And then also what Margaret Urban Walker says about the role of blame in moral repair, and specifically some of the things she points to regarding failures of blame and what those look like and what those do. So the kind of slogan I come up with for why reactive blame is valuable and good for us is that it plays this uniquely communicative role in valuing what we ought to value and in sustaining moral norms essential to our shared moral communities. So that's kind of like the slogan-y version. So insofar as we want to live in communities that value anything, I think reactive blame plays a crucial role in doing that. So if we want to kind of get into the details a little bit more, I think the lesson to learn from Franklin's work is that actually valuing the proper objects of value is kind of demanding. It involves more than just judging that they're valuable. So saying like, oh, I value national parks. If you never go to them and you never they never play a role in your practical deliberation, you don't devote any time to them, I think we'd be skeptical that you actually value them. And so I think his account of what it means to properly value the objects of moral value is really helpful here. One thing that is obviously the proper object of moral value is a person, other persons. And so to not just judge that other persons are valuable, but actively value them requires us to do some things and have certain dispositions towards them. And one of those dispositions is that you have to be disposed to kind of protect and defend them from harm, and especially from actions that carry a meaning that disvalues them. So when people freely choose to behave in certain ways that disvalue other agents, we can't just kind of like let the meaning of those statements stand, or it actually does like detract from the value of the person. And so I like what Franklin says here about protecting and defending the objects of value being this sort of crucial component about properly valuing the objects of value, especially persons. And I think reactive blame is like a necessary feature of doing that. If you don't reactively blame folks who freely disvalue other people, you're failing them in important ways that shows that perhaps you don't actually value them properly. So that I think is one big component of reactive blame. It's like this crucial part of actually valuing other people in the way they deserve and the way that they necessarily call for if we think they're genuinely valuable. And then the reason why reactive blame is the best way to do that is because, as McGeer points out, it's this costly signal. It's hard to fake, and it's also attention grabbing. So it's the best way to protect and defend those objects of value when they are disvalued. I could say, "Hey, don't disvalue my friend," in like this calm, even way,
Right.
and like it's not gonna really flag anyone's interest all that much. But when I say, "Hey, don't just value my friend," and I get a little more angry and worked up about it, that's going to grab your attention and like cause you to look for some reasons to explain why you did what you did, and just to like focus more carefully on the potential violation, etc. So anger itself is, I think, the best kind of means to have this communicative role and protect and defend the objects of value. And then there's all this other interesting stuff we can say about blame and just the broader shared moral community and our moral norms. So when we think about moral norms as opposed to conventional norms, like genuinely moral norms, they're the kinds of things that don't depend on authority. And so there's no like one person kind of telling us this is the way we should treat other people. They're really like a shared project. And so when we fail to blame wrongdoers or folks that transgress those norms by harming other objects of value, other people, I think that can have three different effects. So one is it can just weaken the norm, and that's bad for the kind of well-being of our shared moral community. The other thing it can do is like indicate that the norm in question is not really a norm that we endorse. It's something we're like paying lip service to, but don't really care about. So it can kind of flag the death of a norm might be a way to think about it. And then another thing that failures to blame can tell us is that maybe the person who was harmed, the victim in this case, isn't really a member of the shared community we're thinking of. So if we have this standing norm not to treat other persons in certain ways, but then someone violates that norm, treats the victim in this way, but no one says anything, no one addresses that action with blame, then that might also lead us to believe that we don't really value that person as a genuine member of the shared moral community. So failures, if they start to become widespread, I think can have these really devastating effects on the strength of the norms themselves. They can tell us some things about whether or not we actually endorse them or just pay lip service to them. And then failing to blame can actually serve to kind of like note that folks are being pushed out of the moral community or might not be full members. And so I think reactive blame is super important to sustain all of that norm building and norm maintaining stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. So why do you think that the blame in the sensitive issue is genuinely deserved in the basic sense?
Yeah. So this is the really hard question, I think, when it comes to all of the different projects in the book. This is the one that's really like the big tough one. Is to try to argue that reactive, angry blame really is deserved in the basic sense. I think that's what we need. That's at the heart of the issue that skeptics and curmudgeons are trying to get at when they argue against reactive blame. And so I have kind of a twofold strategy to argue this. Maybe it's a threefold strategy because I just said something really simple about it a few minutes ago. I think once you adopt the fittingness account, as I said, that gives us this really kind of deflationary picture of what basic desert of reactive blame depends on. So I think if we agree that the right kind of reasons to blame and what renders reactive blame deserved in the basic sense just has something to do with the violation of an expectation that constitutes our interpersonal relationships, of course, blame is deserved in the basic sense a lot of the time. There's just kind of this simple reflection that's like, yeah, people violate this stuff. We definitely have these expectations. They're a part of what kind of creates our interpersonal relationships in the first place. And when people violate them, they deserve our blame. So there's kind of like just sort of basic, if we think about blame in this way, it should be kind of obvious that we deserve blame in the basic sense. But I understand that that sort of claim is never going to be like persuasive to anyone who doesn't agree in the first place. So I try to give two different kinds of arguments for bolstering this idea that reactive blame can be deserved in the basic sense once we adopt the fittingness account. So one of them is a parity of reasons argument. So basically, I point out that there's this similarity between a subset of our moral judgments that have this privileged status in our moral theorizing more broadly. They're the ones that are widely convergent and concrete in the sense that they elicit like a strong emotional response. So I give the example of Timmy the toddler in the book, and it's a story about his brother like intentionally burning him with lit cigarettes and torturing him. And so we hear a case like this and we go, everyone agrees that what Jimmy's doing is wrong. And so it's widely convergent, and it's also accompanied by this affective response of like anger or resentment. And I think that when we look at the way that sort of judgment plays a role in our moral theorizing, we recognize that it's got this privileged epistemic status. Theories should respect our judgment about Timmy's case and the fact that it's wrong. And insofar as they don't, they've got like a lot of explaining to do. That's going to be a serious point against the view. And so I think there is a similarity here between those kinds of judgments and our what I call our blaming judgments once we settle on reactive blame in particular. So by parity of reasons, I think that our reasons for taking this broader class of moral judgments seriously outweigh our reasons for being suspicious about the epistemic status of our attributions of reactive blame. And so, insofar as they're similar, their epistemic status should stand or fall together. And so, if we want to retain the sort of feature of our broader moral theorizing, we should be willing to extend the same privilege status to our judgments of reactive blame, given that they share this important similarity. So this is kind of a companions in innocence parity of reasons argument. Yeah. If you think these judgments have this good status over here, you should say the same thing about our judgments attributing reactive blame. And so we should defeasibly think that we've got good reason to think those attributions are getting things right. And then if you don't like that argument, I also pair it with the companions in guilt parity of reasons argument and say, hey, if you want to be a skeptic about these reactive attributions of blame, you should be a skeptic over here about the same sorts of judgments in our broader moral theorizing. Good luck with that. I don't know how you're going to do any work over here in the moral domain if you want to be suspicious about these kinds of judgments. And so that's kind of like a pragmatic reason not to be a skeptic and not decide and not determine that these sorts of judgments have this status. But I think we've got kind of like a parity of reasons, companions and innocence argument for thinking we have direct evidence that our attributions of reactive blame are actually accurate in getting things right. And then if you don't like that, you're stuck with the companions of guilt argument, where I'm going to say, okay, but you've got some kind of crazy implications over here for your moral theorizing that you're stuck with if you want to stick to your skepticism over here. So that's one kind of argument I give to kind of support the idea that reactive blame can be deserved in the basic sense once we accept the fittingness account. And then the other one, which I actually like more, I think this is kind of the fun one, is I think there are also some lessons we can learn from objections to perceptual models of the emotions. So there's this other like broad dialectic that I think we can learn some lessons from. And sometimes folks try to make the claim that we should draw this analogy between sense perception and our emotional perceptions, and that like the epistemic status that our perceptual so our sense perceptions have should be extended over to the emotions. I think that's a bad argument because there are important disanalogies. But when you dig into one of like the primary objections, I think you see kind of a carve out for why some of our emotional perceptions might have this privileged epistemic status, and we should think that they're getting things right. And so the objection I have in mind is the one that highlights the fact that there are these important epistemologically relevant differences between our perceptual experiences and our emotional experiences, which bars our emotional experiences from constituting direct evidence for the truth of their propositional content. But on the heels of this, I think that there's this subset of our emotions, namely those emotions and experiences that correspond explicitly to moral evaluative beliefs. And those can provide indirect evidence for thinking that our attributions of reactive blame are getting things right. So maybe I'll just give the analogy. I can't, for reasons of time, can't get too far into like the nuances of the dialectic. But here's the upshot. So I think the negative reactive attitudes function as a kind of reason detector. So they can't give us direct evidence that the right kind of reasons to blame are present, but they do offer pretty good indirect evidence that there are such reasons around. So I have the analogy of like a metal detector. If you have like a treasure map and it's got like X marks the spot, and you take a metal detector to the beach and it goes off like near the location of the X, the beeping metal detector doesn't give you like direct evidence that there's treasure there, but it's really good indirect evidence. We think it's rational for you to like go back and, with a shovel and try to dig things up. And I think that the affective component of reactive blame does much the same thing. It's the best evidence we have for thinking that there is actually a violation of an expectation constitutive to our interpersonal relationships. That's the thing that functions psychologically for us as like a kind of alarm bell to say, hey, look, violation.
Yeah.
Right.
It's not always right. Of course, it's like defeasible indirect evidence, but it's kind of the best we have, I think, in this domain. So I think that's another reason to think that when we restrict our focus to reactive blame and we adopt a fittingness account, the emotional component of reactive blame actually gives us some pretty good indirect evidence for thinking blame is actually deserved
Mm-hmm.
in the cases where we feel that corresponding emotion of resentment or anger.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So far, you've made the case for the need to include blame in our moral lives and also that it's permissible to do so, but this might not be enough to convince the sort of blame curmudgeon who thinks that we ought to eliminate blame from our moral lives. What are some ways that you respond to this more extreme sort of position?
Yeah, so the second half of the book, once I spend the first part arguing for the permissibility of reactive blame, and so I give these arguments for thinking it's valuable and it can be deserved in the basic sense, I move on to these prescriptive eliminativists. So, like the true blame curmudgeon is going to argue not just that we're never free and responsible and blame is never deserved in the basic sense.
Mm-hmm.
They're also going to argue that we should do some stuff. We should get rid of blame, the angry kind in particular, and also any attendant practices and attitudes that depend on it. So those are my targets in the second half of the book. Here, things get like really complicated. So you have to kind of dive into all of these methodological issues. And I think one way of thinking about the purpose of the second half of the book is just to kind of clean up this methodological mess that we find in disagreements between like full-blown eliminativists and success theorists about free will, responsibility, and reactive blame. Because there's not really like a clear picture of what these eliminativists have to do to like successfully motivate this really radical position that we should like overhaul our lives in important ways. So what I try to focus on mainly is identifying what I think are these two primary burdens for eliminativists. So the first thing that they have to do is identify and also fix what I call the skeptical spotlight. So when you have skeptical views in any domain, what usually happens is you've got the identification of some kind of like problematic feature of the concept in question. It's either naturalistically implausible, maybe it's even incoherent or logically impossible, or it just doesn't sit consistently with other really powerful background beliefs. And so sometimes the way the skepticism is presented as this kind of inconsistent set. Given that we believe all this other stuff, we can't believe that people are deserving of blame in the basic sense too.
Mm-hmm.
So blame should go. And so what I want to point out about those kinds of motivations for skepticism and then further eliminativism is that there's some more work you have to do to really make that argument. It's not enough to just say like, hey, here's a problem with blame. It's or free will and responsibility. It is inconsistent with all this other stuff we really like and think is true. So problem solved, let's get rid of blame. That's kind of how like the argument feels sometimes.
Yeah.
But what you have to do is not just like identify that problem. That's what I would call kind of like identifying the skeptical spotlight or like turning it on in the first place.
Right.
But you have to really fix it on the problematic feature of the target concept, because if you don't, there's this sort of Morean move that's in the offing that we get in, the response to epistemological skepticism, where, a skeptic says to G.E. Moore, hey, I don't know anything at all. And Moore says, cool. I mean, I know I have two hands. So I feel more confident about the fact that I have two hands than I do about this definition of knowledge we were talking about. So I guess the definition of knowledge should go, not my belief that I have two hands. And so I think what eliminativists have to do is kind of anticipate that sort of Morean move. They can't just say, here's a problem, so let's get rid of the concept it's a feature of, in this case, free will, responsibility, and blame. They have to give at least some kind of comparative defense for why that's the thing that should go, not one of the other background commitments that gives rise to like the tension or the inconsistency. So I think eliminativists have to do that, and most of them are not doing that so far. And then once you fix the skeptical spotlight, I think they also have to meet what I call the motivational challenge. So you have to motivate that we should actually adopt full-blown eliminativism rather than any kind of preservationist alternative once you've identified this sort of error or problem. And I think they have two options for doing this, and you see both in different places. So one option is to try to argue, give an argument based on the gains and losses. So this kind of Straussian pragmatic argument where you say, look, we're better off, or we're at least not any worse off without free will, responsibility, and reactive blame. So let's get rid of it. Or you can try to argue that we just can't retain free will, responsibility, and blame without this like problematic feature that's identified by the skeptical spotlight. I think a lot of times these two strategies for motivating eliminativism sometimes they get run together, and sometimes they're problematically treated as completely independent. I think the most prominent one is probably the gains and losses argument. But the problem with that, I think, is that you can't really motivate it without saying something about the other necessity claim. Like the way we assess gains and losses is going to depend on whether or not this problematic feature of free will, responsibility, and blame is actually a necessary feature of free will, responsibility, and blame. So I think you can't just like be off to the races with gains and losses without like diving into this really tricky stuff about what essential features of free will and responsibility and blame look like. Or even worse, questions about how the term free will refers and how we fix the extension and all that stuff. So the kind of short version here is that I think eliminativists need to tackle these questions about necessity and reference. You can't successfully motivate full-blown eliminativism without doing that. And so I have this very boring chapter that's all about reference and free will and how we assess existence claims. It's like a very long, boring chapter. And I just want to flag that if you really want like a better, like a smarter person to tell you about reference, read Ocean Deary's book. Where he argues for like a lot of similar conclusions that I am in this chapter. He just does like an amazing, inclusive job of doing so in his book, where he kind of argues free will is a natural kind in terms of like homeostatic property clusters. I couldn't do all that stuff in a chapter, but I try to give kind of a short version of the same thing, which is that I don't think any current arguments from eliminativists that claim free will fails to refer and our existence claims are false are very good. So I kind of run through all the options here, and I look at in particular the most elimination friendly versions of how free will refers. So I'm thinking especially of like Sean Nichols' recent work where he gives this discretionary view of free will, and he says, look, free will is an ambiguous kind term. What that means is that in some contexts, the reference fixing conventions are different for the term. And so when eliminativists say free will doesn't exist, their sort of motivating concerns are concerns about undeserved harm for wrongdoers. And so that kind of like triggers this descriptive reference fixing convention. And so when they say free will doesn't exist, what they say is true. But when the preservationist or the success theorist says, hey, free will does exist, it might just be different than what we think it is, their interests, which are usually the stuff about the value of blame and protecting and defending victims, those trigger a kind of causal historical reference fixing convention. And so they do, the way free will refers for them does pick out an actual feature of the world. And so their claims are true also. That's like a very short version of a very complicated view. But I think it's like the most kind of elimination hospitable way of thinking about the way free will refers. And so if even on that view, elimination isn't in good shape, then I think eliminativists are in trouble. And what I ultimately conclude is that they are in trouble. That even on a discretionary view, if we think free will is a sort of ambiguous kind term, the way things shake out, still, it's going to be really tough to make the case that free will doesn't refer, that the extension is empty. And so I think the burden is on eliminativists to kind of tackle this annoying project involving reference and essence to kind of motivate their view against prescriptive competitors. And then kind of the last thing I think we should consider in regard to eliminativists and kind of how to tackle their prescriptive claims is that we should always assume a kind of fallback to a brute pragmatic argument in kind of the vein of P.F. Strawson. So once Strawson made this like gains and losses point, everyone loves to like analyze them. And there's just always going to be this assumption that even if we can give a theoretical account of why reactive blame is deserved in the basic sense and also valuable, there's still going to be this lingering worry that it's just so bad for us, we should get rid of it. Sort of like brute pragmatic argument. So at the end of the book, I kind of consider, I go back to that sort of argument and say, look, let's say you want to ignore everything I just spent 100 pages talking about in chapter 5 and chapter 6. You just don't want to dive into this stuff and you want to give a brute pragmatic argument. I don't think eliminativists can really do that either. So the sorts of things they point to and that they tend to call the dark side of free will are things like the correlation with some really troubling political views. So things like just world beliefs, where we think victims deserve what they get, and right-wing authoritarianism. There's like some evidence for a correlation between the belief that we have free will and those sorts of like nasty, upsetting political beliefs. And so I think if there was like a causal connection between beliefs and free will and those disturbing worldviews, we could have some like brute pragmatic reason to like back off on free will and the idea that we deserve blame in the basic sense. But I don't think there is evidence for an actual causal connection. When you like dive into the actual empirical work, there's definitely a correlation. But I think that's because most people think we have free will. And so the free will belief is going to be correlated with like whatever problematic set you pick. And so when it comes to the just world beliefs in particular and the victim blaming stuff, all of the examples that are being considered are like cases where like we're talking about blaming rape victims and like poor people for getting themselves into the position they find themselves in. And there's just a much better explanation for why the subjects have those beliefs. And it has something to do with like racism, sexism, stuff like that. That's a way better explanatory story about what's causing those worldviews than the belief that we have free will. So that's kind of my criticism of those. And then the other big point about the dark side of free will that you often hear is kind of to return to this basic eliminativist or curmudgeonly motivating concern about harming the innocent who don't deserve it. And one thing about that sort of concern, I think we need to flag, and why it doesn't help like push the pragmatic considerations in favor of eliminativism, is because eliminativists can't really tell us a story about why there's a prohibition on harming the innocent either. They're like especially ill-suited to bolster that sort of like basic bedrock moral intuition, because for the eliminativist, there is no distinction between who's innocent and who's guilty. No one is deserving of blame in the basic sense. And so like the whole dichotomy kind of dissolves if you're an eliminativist. So I don't see how eliminativists are going to tell us a story about why we shouldn't harm the innocent who don't deserve that harm in the first place. And I just don't think this is a good thing for them to point to in their pragmatic arguments. And then at the very end, what I really think we should do, if we're going to focus on this kind of pragmatic argument and where my current interests lie, is we should think about this sort of victim-centered perspective and focus on what I call this argument from empathy, and think about like the kinds of things eliminativists would have to say to victims. And I find those implications just kind of morally intolerable. And I think that really shifts the burden back to eliminativists. If we're assessing gains and losses, I'd rather be an angry blamer than tell the victim of a rape that she should not be angry, that her anger is unfitting and it would be better for her to give it up. That just strikes me as like, can't do it.
Yeah, that argument from empathy is really interesting. So yeah, thanks for mentioning that. Well, thanks so much for all of this, Kelly. This has been a great conversation, and I'll encourage our audience again to check out your book and keep up with your current work. Where can listeners go to find your work?
So they can just check out Phil Papers. They can look at my webpage, TCU at tcu.edu. And then they can also just shoot me an email. I think, especially if they're interested in the argument from empathy stuff, I've been working on that a lot more recently. And so if you want to hear more about that, just like shoot me an email at k.mccormick at tcu.edu.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks again.
Yeah. Thank you guys. Thanks for the invite.
Of course.
Yeah. In our next episode, we'll talk about intention and memory. And our guest will be Wayne Wu, professor in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Pittsburgh.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.